This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zacharisa.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zacharisa, the editor-in-chief at FanDuel and at numberfire.com, and this is episode 423 of the Late Round Podcast, on many shows that are part of the FanDuel Podcast Network. Thanks for tuning in. If you missed out on the first 4 weeks of the NFL season, don't worry. The stage is set for you to play for a big payday in Week 5 with the FanDuel Sunday Million. For just $4.44, you can enter the Week 5 NFL Sunday Million and compete for your share of the $2.5 million prize pool, including a $1 million first place prize. For more details, visit FanDuel.com or download the FanDuel app today. Eligibility restrictions apply. Now let's be concise, as we do on this show, and get to this week's 15 transactions. Buy Chase Edmonds. So Kenyon Drake was supposed to be the guy in Arizona this year, and he's sort of been that. He's handled 80.7% of Arizona's running back rushes. He's played 67.3% of the team's snaps. Those are both top 10 numbers at the position. It's just that it hasn't resulted in fantasy points. Drake has now finished outside the top 30 in fantasy scoring in each of the last 3 weeks. He hasn't had a touchdown since week 1. And I do think that there is some concern. A couple of weeks ago, I thought that Kenyon Drake was a decent buy low candidate because of the upcoming schedule. He wasn't seeing that much volume through the air back then, and you were hoping for more. You were hoping that he saw a little bit more volume there. And it's actually gone in the opposite direction. He's only seen 3.7% of the team's targets this year, and his target share over the last 2 weeks has been 3% and 0%. And for some context, when Drake was traded to the Cardinals last year, he dropped below a 10% target share in just 1 of 8 games. And then you look at Chase Edmonds and what he's doing. He's seen 12.7% of Arizona's targets this year out of that backfield, and he had a 19.4% target share in week 4. Edmonds now has 4 total red zone touches, as does Kenyon Drake. And he has the same number of goal line touches as well. I don't think this means that you should sell Kenyon Drake. Don't get me wrong. He's still seeing volume. His rushing numbers aren't as bad as they appear. He has a 3.8 yards per carry average, but his success rate, which is the percentage of positive expected points runs made by a player, according to NumberFire's net expected points model, his success rate's fine. And the Cardinals still have a very, very good upcoming schedule. You would just be selling Kenyon Drake very, very low. But in Drake's range of outcomes is Edmonds taking on a slightly larger role on the ground, and that could result in a higher valued fantasy asset because of the volume that he's seeing through the air that Kenyon Drake's not seeing. So from a value standpoint, I think Chase Edmonds is the buy right now. And that's whether you have Kenyon Drake or not. In fact, I'd be more inclined to not trade for Chase Edmonds if I have Kenyon Drake, because then I'm looking at a floor and not a ceiling. Add Justin Jackson. So Austin Eckler's hurt. He had a really tough hamstring injury in week 4. He could miss a lot of time. And that's going to open things up a lot for Joshua Kelly, of course, in that backfield, but also Justin Jackson. On Sunday against the Buccaneers, Jackson saw a third of LA's running back rushes and he had a pair of targets. He's going to be involved, especially as a pass catcher with Austin Eckler out. And that makes him a priority off the waiver wire this week. Sell or hold Joe Mixon. So I've got a lot to say about Joe Mixon this week. I was very pleased with what he did in week 4. It was honestly a perfect outing. He scored 42 PPR fantasy points. He had 93% of Cincinnati's running back rushes. He had a 17.1% target share. The question we need to ask ourselves now, though, is not whether or not Joe Mixon is capable of doing this. Joe Mixon's talent has never been in question. What we have to ask is this usage the new norm? And I'm a little bit worried about him being able to maintain this. Now, on the plus side, the Bengals got a win, and that was a win with Joe Mixon seeing this type of workload. But anything with Mixon comes down to his receiving. His highest single-game target share last season was 13.9%. He hit the 10% target share mark in fewer than half of his games. During his 3 NFL seasons before this 2020 season, Mixon's top single-season target share has been 10.4%, and that was during a season where Giovanni Bernard missed 4 games. Now, please understand, I think Joe Mixon is a way better receiver and player than Giovanni Bernard. And that's what makes this whole situation so tough. If I thought that Joe Mixon sucked, then this would easily be able to be sold off as an anomaly, as an outlier. But I think Mixon's good. But as a numbers-driven analyst, I can't let one game against the Jags overshadow the fact that historically and from weeks 1 through 3, Mixon has not been used this heavily as a receiver. And let's just be honest. Prior to week 4, Mixon sucked. Whether it was Mixon himself or his offensive line or his situation, it doesn't matter. NumberFire's expected points model hated Joe Mixon. His efficiency was awful. This has nothing to do with Mixon as a talent, like I said. This has to do with the coaching staff and the environment that he's in. And that environment is one that doesn't always feature him as the top pass catcher in that backfield. When they're in negative game scripts and in hurry-up offenses. We've seen Giovanni Bernard on the field this year in those situations. And that's the fear. Point blank. And moving forward, Cincinnati gets Baltimore, Indianapolis, Cleveland, Tennessee, and Pittsburgh. There are some softer matchups later in the season for them. But there's a chance that we don't see the Bengals with that much of a lead in the short term. So here's where I stand overall. I know I just threw a lot of information at you, but here's where I stand. If you're a winless or a one-win team, you might be able to sell Joe Mixon high. You need the wins right now. And the upcoming schedule does not look super great for Mixon and this Bengals offense, or at least the rushing attack. Now, if you've got Mixon on a competitive roster, I think that you can hold tight. He's the most talented running back in that backfield. He's a more than capable pass catcher. And maybe, just maybe, this wasn't just a fluke. Maybe it's a sign of what's to come. I hope it's a sign of what's to come. Because Mixon is a very, very good running back. Buy Marquise Brown. Look, you know what you're getting when it comes to Hollywood Brown. He's a big play receiver. He's likely not going to have a high target total week in and week out thanks to Baltimore's defense and their run-first mentality. But right now, he's a pretty clear buy candidate. His lowest single-game target share has been 22% this year. And he ranks well inside the top 15 in overall target share at the wide receiver position. That's very important. He needs a high target share in this type of offense. It's not like he's part of the Cowboys offense. Although that would be amazing to see Marquise Brown in that Dallas offense. But in a Dallas offense, you can see a 16-17% target share and be fine. In a Baltimore offense, you need a 25% target share. You need a high target share to be a week in and week out starter. But of course, Brown is also seeing his typical high average depth of target too. He's top 10 in air yards so far this year. The issue is that he hasn't found the end zone yet. And he's not going to be targeted that heavily within the red zone, within the 10-yard line, or in the end zone week in and week out. But even still, given his big play ability, given his air yard total, Brown should have scored by now. He was actually down at the 1 this past week. So the peripherals are there for Hollywood Brown. A huge game for him is coming. Add Keyshawn Vaughn. If you listened to this podcast last week, last mailbag episode, I talked about Keyshawn Vaughn and how he was a decent, deeper roster add before this weekend's games. And then what happened in that Buccaneers game, Leonard Fournette was already out, and then LaShawn McCoy got hurt too. And that left the Buccaneers with just Ronald Jones and Keyshawn Vaughn. Vaughn played 25% of Tampa Bay's snaps. He caught 2 of his 3 targets for 22 yards and a touchdown. He actually had more receiving yards than Ronald Jones on just a third of Ronald Jones's targets. And not only that, but according to Pro Football Focus, Ronald Jones had 2 drops. You could even argue that he had 3 drops in that game. And he's now tied for the league lead among relevant running backs in drop rate. Now, the statistic of drops is pretty irrelevant in fantasy football. It doesn't have that much predictive power. But this is nothing new for Ronald Jones. This has always been an issue for Rojo. He has stone hands. He's always been a good early down runner. That's never been the issue. The issue has been pass catching. And that's where Keyshawn Vaughn can thrive. He was one of the better pass catchers in this year's draft class. So maybe all of this leads to Keyshawn Vaughn seeing more playing time. And that makes him a worthy speculative add. Sell Mike Evans. So on this same team, we saw Mike Evans this past weekend have a really strong outing. He caught 7 of his 8 targets, he had 122 receiving yards, and he had a touchdown too. He's now scored 5 touchdowns this year on 26 targets. And that's an obvious reason that he's a sell. It's unlikely that he's going to be able to keep up this touchdown scoring pace. Now, he does rank higher than average in end zone targets and targets within the 10, the targets that you want players to see in order to get a high touchdown total. But his targets per touchdown rate of 5.2 is higher than his 17.4 career average. And he's scoring a touchdown for every 46 receiving yards. His career average is a touchdown on every 151 receiving yards. There's also the Chris Godwin effect. Godwin's been out for 2 games this year. In those games where he hasn't played, Evans has seen 28.6% of the team's targets and 17.8% of them. In the 2 games with Chris Godwin, those target share marks have fallen below 12%. Now look, guys, there's nothing wrong with Mike Evans. Without any cost involved, you would want Mike Evans on your fantasy team. He's just playing a little bit over his head right now in the fantasy points scored department. Sell Tom Brady. Now, the obvious transition here from Mike Evans is to go to Tom Brady as quarterback. Anytime you have an opportunity to sell high on a pocket passer, so not a guy who can run, you should jump on it in fantasy football. That's what we have with Tom Brady. He has 11 touchdowns and 1,122 yards through the air. Since 2011, a player with that yardage total, and remember guys, yards strongly correlate to touchdowns, but a player with that yardage total, 1,122 yards, he would have been expected to have thrown fewer than 7 touchdowns at this point. That's larger than a 4 touchdown difference for Tom Brady, and that's the second highest in the league behind only Russell Wilson. And Russell Wilson is a unicorn. And Brady's touchdown rate shows that as well. He's thrown a touchdown on 7.1% of his attempts this year. That's a rate that he hasn't hit since 2010. So touchdown regression is coming for Tom Brady. Buy Darius Slayton. So one of my favorite lower key buys this week is Darius Slayton. The Giants have been an offensive disaster this year. They only have 2 passing touchdowns, and they rank 3rd worst in yards per play. But they've also faced the Steelers, Bears, 49ers, and Rams. And through this tough stretch, one of the positives has been Darius Slayton. He's seen almost 21% of the team's targets, and he ranks inside the top 20 across the league in air yards. He's seeing looks, and he's seeing looks down the field. That combination is going to come in handy when this Giants schedule opens up, and that starts this weekend against Dallas. Add Teddy Bridgewater. So Teddy's coming off a game where he threw for 276 yards, 2 touchdowns, and he showed off some mobility too. He had 32 rushing yards and a touchdown on the ground. And the great part about Bridgewater is he's still underperforming this year. He has a touchdown rate of just 2.8%. That's well below the league's average. He's only thrown 4 passing touchdowns on 1,147 yards. So just do the same conversion that we just did with Tom Brady. Brady's overperforming, but Bridgewater, he should have 3 more passing touchdowns than he currently has. And then you combine that with a game against a beatable Falcons secondary this weekend, and he is a very, very good streamer. Buy Jonathan Taylor. So look, guys, admittedly, things have not trended in the right direction for Jonathan Taylor. In week 2, which was his first game as a starter, he had a 74.3% running back rush share and 8% target share. Things were fine. And then in week 3, those numbers fell to 44.8% and 4%. Not great. And this past week, it was 48.6% and 3.6%. So things are trending down. They're trending in the wrong direction. Now, the good news is that over the last couple of weeks where Taylor's seen this rushing share dip, he's been the most effective Colts running back. He has a 36.7% success rate, and that's 11 percentage points better than Nyheim Hines and 14 percentage points better than Jordan Wilkins. Now, Taylor's target share has dropped too. But according to Pro Football Focus, he's ran the most routes on that team at running back since taking over in week 2. And over the last 2 weeks, Nyheim Hines has seen just 5 more routes run. It's just unfortunate that the Colts aren't throwing that much. But within the context of his team, things haven't been so horrific. And remember, guys, this is about buying into a good running back too. Jonathan Taylor had one of the best analytical profiles that I've ever seen a running back have in my time in doing this. He should be a very, very good running back. He's only 4 games into his career, and that's a rookie season that didn't have a preseason. And then most importantly, Indianapolis is going to continue to see a nice schedule moving forward, especially over the next 3 weeks where they get the Browns, Bengals, and Lions. So I like Jonathan Taylor a lot long term, but then I also like him a lot in the short term. Add Dearness Johnson. So Nick Chubb's going to miss several weeks with a knee injury. Kareem Hunt gets a massive, massive boost, but Dearness Johnson does too. In their week 4 game against the Cowboys, Johnson saw 37.1% of Cleveland's running back rushes. He had 13 rushes for 95 yards. He's going to be in a split backfield with Hunt moving forward. He's going to see some looks. And that might give him some flex appeal in a Browns offense that's pretty run heavy. But then in deeper leagues, don't sleep on Dontrell Hilliard. he'll also probably have a shot to get some work. And he's got far, far better measurables than Johnson does. Add Damian Harris. So Damian Harris made this episode last week, but after a pretty strong performance on Monday night against the Chiefs, I think this transaction needed to be restated because he's still only rostered in about 30% of Yahoo leagues. Sony Michel is on injured reserve with a quad injury, and that allowed Damian Harris to be the number one early down guy for New England on Monday. He ran the ball 17 times, and he had 100 yards. He accounted for 54.8% of New England's running back rushes. There's nothing wrong with that. Right now, he's worth an ad to at least see how things unfold. I thought he looked pretty good on Monday night. Add Robert Tonyan. So originally, this was going to be a drop carry on Johnson transaction, so if you have Johnson, feel free to drop him. But then Robert Tonyan happened on Monday night. He has to be on this week's list. Against the Falcons, he caught 6 of his 6 targets for 98 yards and 3 touchdowns. And that's coming off a game where he had a 16.7% target share, and he caught all 5 of his targets for 50 yards and a touchdown. Now, his uptick has definitely correlated with Devontae Adams being sidelined. But given how Tonyan is playing right now, they may have to keep using him. Add Justin Herbert. Justin Herbert right now ranks in the top 5 in yards per attempt across the NFL. He's posted 22 plus fantasy points in 2 of his 3 games played this year. He looks amazing. He's a lot of fun to watch too. And those fantasy totals might look pretty good moving forward because the Chargers get the Saints, Jets, Dolphins, Jags, Raiders, and Broncos over their next 6 games. So far this year, 4 of those teams have been plus matchups when looking at adjusted fantasy points allowed to the quarterback position. And the other 2, the Jets and the Raiders, aren't very scary on paper. So Herbert should at least be a good streamer this week against the Saints, where according to FanDuel Sportsbook, that game has a 52-point over-under. Add the Texans defense. The Texans are winless, their defense sucks, but they're 6.5-point favorites this week against the Jags. And that Jaguars offense has allowed back-to-back top 10 defensive performances in fantasy football. The Jags rank 8th worst in sack rate allowed this year, and Gardner Minshew has thrown at least 1 pick in each of his last 3 games. Houston has issues. Houston's defense sucks, but they should be a decent enough streamer here in Week 5. The 16th transaction this week that you can't get in my 15 transactions column over on numberfire.com is to add Darnell Mooney. So the rookie Darnell Mooney has been playing ahead of Anthony Miller throughout this 2020 season. And not a lot of people are talking about it because the Bears offense just generally sucks. Miller outsnapped Mooney in Week 1, but Mooney's played more snaps than Miller since. And then finally in Week 4, we finally saw this big target share bump for Mooney. He saw about 22% of Nick Foles' targets, and Anthony Miller was under 10%. Now, the reason this could be semi-notable is that this is the first game that Nick Foles started. If he continues as starter, Mooney could end up being a usable wide receiver in deeper leagues. That's going to do it for today's show, though. Thanks to all of you for listening. If you've yet subscribed to the Late Round Podcast, make sure you are by searching for it pretty much anywhere podcasts can be found. And don't forget to follow me on Twitter @LateRoundQB. Thanks, everyone. I'll be back tomorrow with the weekly 10 Trends Show.